It's fine. They can move wherever they like.
Alright, so I'm going to start out this cube draft here. I'm going to go grab some breakfast and I will be right back to you guys.
Cool.
Have fun with that.
Yay! Alright, welcome everybody. I'm Erwin, obviously. This is my talk about the cube. And basically, sort of what is the cube? The cube is a proprietary format. That means you build it yourself. You play both designer and developer. You get the ability to say how powerful certain colors are, how powerful certain strategies are, and at the same time, because it is Magic, sort of no matter how busted Magic gets, even for example when Steve Maninian was talking about like what if Vintage allowed you to run 4 Black Lotuses, like as retarded as that is, there is still a rock paper scissors sort of formula that stops people from going insane, and that happens in the cube too. And mostly it is in the form of archetypes, but we'll get to archetypes later. Also, you know, it's a way to temper your play, so you can be both as, you know, you can have as powerful or as sort of fun as possible. Because there's people, for example, you can have an all commons cube. You can have a sort of a common/uncommon, you know, good limited cards cube. A lot of people play those. You can have a budget cube where you just, you know, you have really good rares, but you know, like $1 or $2. And then you have sort of the default cube, and that's the one I run. And I run the you know, the best cards in Magic. They're sort of the most powerful creatures I could possibly stuff in there at one time. And with its construction, you know, everybody's construction is a little bit different, but what I would say is that you should always keep the colors equal, which means you should have an equal number of each color. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have, you know, 25 creatures and 25 spells if you have 50 of one color. For example, like my green has more creatures than spells, and my blue has more spells than creatures. And it makes sense that, you know, those are the colors that do that very well. But my white cards and my black cards, there's equal number of creatures and spells. You know, your standard cube size, you know, standard, that I believe at least, is around 410 cards, and that's 50 of each color, 50 artifacts, 50 non-basic lands, and 60 multicolor. That's 5 of each pair, and then 1 of each tricolor. Now that you have shards, which made tricolor cards really, really good, you know, that's probably going to change for me personally. But before shards, there weren't a lot of good tricolor cards. I mean, you're sort of just like throwing in Dromar's Charm and some of the dragons from Invasion, and you're like, you know, these aren't really good, and no one ever really picks them. But you kind of want them in there just for the coalescence of what the cube should be. Because you're going to need 360 cards for an 8-man draft. You know, that's 45 cards a person. So as long as it's at least over 360 cards, you can still have yourself a cube. But if you don't have the colors exactly balanced in terms of the number, then you're going to have someone drafting too much black, too much red, or what have you. Another point I wanted to make was about proxy cards. Now, proxy, you know, is when you'd either print out or you'd have, you know, you'd scribble on them what they're supposed to be. And so that's on a cube by cube basis. For example, I know some people who love to pimp out their cube with the most foil, foreign, incredible versions you can possibly find. But at the same time, if you were to play the cube in like a store, for example, I know a lot of people play, you know, they'll have a real cube, then they'll take it to the store, and they'll actually run, you know, drafts in the store for prizes and things. But then things start missing, and then, you know, there's a lot of questions, people get really awkward. So sometimes you have all proxy cubes located in stores just for fun, just to have fun with it. But, you know, of course, one of the things about the cube is that you can sort of have pride in that, you know, I've got this really rare card that I can, you know, have a lot of fun with. The next thing I want to talk about was sort of like power level, like, you know, how powerful should your cube be? And generally that's, you know, the question is, how many unfair/broken situations are you comfortable with? Because that's pretty much what happens. Because, you know, you have the group that says you should never play power, which is what's like Tom Lapelli. That's sort of our main disagreement on the cube. And then you have those who say power's great, and that's me, because I would rather have, you know, the variance of 1 in 20 to 30 games of just being an absolute blowout, like you just have no chance. And that's just part of the, you know, the cube fun. You're like, oh my god, I got this incredible hand, and you just lose. And they're like, well, maybe I've got the Swords to Plowshares to start your first turn of Chroma, or whatever. But, and then also sort of your, you know, sort of your balancing mechanism. For example, Hearth Kami is really powerful in my cube because I do have power, because it can stop these incredible acceleration type things. It's also a really good card just in balancing terms to stop really broken artifacts. Another, you know, sort of first turn, you know, you got your first turn of Chroma, so you want to have a Swords to Plowshares / Path to Exile. But you also have things like, you know, Mind Twist for 5 on turn 2. And you're like, maybe you should put something in there to combat that. Well, when you see those types of situations happen over and over, you recognize them and you say, well, here's Wiltly Fliege, here's the Decapod, here's Guerrilla Tactics. You begin to, again, just sort of, you manipulate your cube in little tiny ways to make these incredibly overpowered strategies have the foils to them. Even if you lose all your hand, at least you can deal a bunch of damage with a red deck, for example. For me and Lapelli, the main issue was, Ancestral Recall is too good, but Ancestral Vision isn't. Time Walk is too good, but Time Warp isn't. I guess there's a certain mana scale in which people are satisfied that this card is expensive enough to where it's okay in this queue or what have you. So you can have instead of Black Lotus you got Lotus Bloom, instead of Time Walk, Time Warp, instead of Wheel of Fortune you can have Wheel of Fate. Though Wheel of Fortune really isn't that great anyway, so we don't really have to worry about replacing that one. The best cards in the cube, are always relative because each cube is different and is sort of tailored to your own taste. Generally, the number one accepted best card in any cube ever, if you have it in there, is Soul Ring. And Soul Ring is just ridiculous. Soul Ring basically puts you 2 turns ahead of your opponent. Now, Black Lotus is awesome, but it's still just a one-shot. It's still, I'm going to play this spell, and if you have an answer to it, I'm screwed. Soul Ring is, I'm always going to be ahead of you in mana, generally, for the first 7 or 8 turns of the game. So that card's really ridiculous. Now, after you go past Soul Ring, everyone just has their own favorites of what happens they may be. For example, mine's Library of Alexandria, because I've never actually lost when I have Library of Alexandria in my opening hand. Like one time, no joke, 5 lands, Library of Alexandria, 4 Spike, won that game. Oh yeah, destroyed them. And otherwise, you have your Lotus, Ancestral Recall, Time Walk. Other cards which I thought were really interesting, things that sort of snuck up on me, like Scroll Rack. Like I really underestimated Scroll Rack when I first built my cube. And then someone basically built Blue-Red Counterburn and showed me how good that card really was. And because with any shuffle effect or any card draw, brainstorm, what have you, you can begin to manipulate yourself to ridiculous situations. Other fantastic cards in the cube that kind of snuck up on me, Crystal Shard. Crystal Shard is just ridiculous. Basically, in the cube, the most powerful creatures generally have repeatable effects. Whether it's something like Mother of Runes, whether it's like 8.5 Tails, whether it's Solemn Simulacrum, something. And Crystal Shard allows you to, bounce things like Shriek Maw or whatever to begin to slowly get incremental advantages over your opponent. Other cards that really are just like some of the best. Obviously, the Planeswalkers are ridiculous just because they're a little harder to deal with than your average permanent. And of course, as you move forward in your cube design, you'll find that you'll have to begin including more answers to Planeswalkers. Other cards include Survival of the Fittest / Recurring Nightmare. Now, that's sort of its own deck, as it were. But even by themselves, those cards are just ridiculous. Recurring Nightmare gives you the ability to just do stupid tricks with legendary dragons and things that come into play. And of course, Survival of the Fittest with something like Genesis is just the most ridiculous thing ever. Let's see, Sophie, they're sort of Fire and Ice. Huge fan of that card because more or less, blue and red cards are some of the best in the cube, just because obviously blue deals with everything and red kills everything else or burns everyone else out. So when your creature can't be dealt with by either of those colors, you have a better time at winning. Some of the hard to deal with creatures, some of like the best creatures in the cube, generally have to do with like creatures that can give you like a huge army, like Moloku the Clouded Mirror, which is obviously ridiculous and has been ridiculous ever since it came out in Kamigawa. Vesuvian Shapeshifter I'm a big fan of because that basically answers every legendary creature and gives you the ability to copy their best creature. You can also have, of course, the Fathom Seer combo in there, so you can draw a bunch of cards. Genesis is also fantastic. Again, these creatures have repeatable abilities that over time just create incremental advantages that provide you wins. And Genesis, with something like obviously Eternal Witness and whatnot, just begins to roll the engine of you're going to have to deal with this now or you're in big trouble. So when you see cards like that taking over your cubes and you're like, you know what, I'm not really comfortable with the Genesis interactions or the Recurring Nightmares, that's when you start putting in like Yixlid Jailer, you start putting in Tormod's Crypt, Relic of Progenitus, the whole, let's put in some more Graveyard Hate and try to put that in each color in some form or fashion, even if it's just something like Morning Tide, just so you can have something in each color to deal with graveyard hate. And also Shroud creatures are really powerful. Obviously Troll Ascetic and Simic Sky Swaller in reanimation strategies, or sometimes when you just raw dog the Simic Sky Swaller and you're like 6/6 untargetable monster, good luck. You ain't got the Wrath, you're probably in big trouble. And one of the most powerful, and basically the way that a lot of people look at the cube is they're like, here's just a bunch of good cards, and I want to throw a bunch of good cards together and see what happens. And that's generally what happens in groups playing the cube for certain amounts of time. And then as you continue to play the cube, you notice that the people who are doing the best are drafting archetypes. They're no longer drafting just bunches of good cards. They're going, I'm going to pick a strategy, and I'm going to carry that strategy out. Even if I have to pass some ridiculous bomb, as long as I can stick to my strategy, then I'll generally be successful. Because every card should be good. For me, your cube is successful when your 15th pick is like, I can't believe this is 15th. Like, if that's your feeling, then that's generally a good cube for me. Sometimes 14th, sometimes 15th. Because you'll have to include things like Naturalize or Oxidize, just little sort of mediocre cards that deal with a lot of problems. But I just want to go over some of the archetypes. Some of my favorites, obviously Blue-White Control is the first one I wanted to cover. Now, everyone knows what Blue-White Control does. They generally destroy creatures, they counterspell things, they have a lot of finishers like Decree of Justice and Acroma. They hope to get really good blue creatures like Kega, Maloku, and Vesuvian Shapeshifter and things. And also cards with, again, incremental advantages like Jushi Apprentice, which are extremely powerful because if you don't kill them immediately, they will just completely take over. And so when you're drafting Blue-White Control, you have to be able to pass the Magma Jet, you have to be able to pass the Genesis. You have to be able to commit yourself and say, I'm not sort of going to veer into random good cards. This is what I'm going to do. So you get to table cards that are good for your archetype, like Sacred Mesa. Cards that over time, when you have all this mana and you have all these counter spells, that you can slowly take over the game for yourself. Another one of my favorites is White-Green Aggro. White-Green Aggro generally has stuff like Rogue Elephant, the first turn 3/3. Now, Wild Mikado is great, but there's just not enough. There's really not enough right now sort of fixing / sack plans, / duels to sort of make that work, rather than just your first turn 3/3 sack a forest is pretty solid. And again, you'll have stuff like Savannah Lions and Paladin Onbeck, and whenever you're dealing with any sort of weenie strategy, what you generally want to ramp up to is Armageddon. So if you will first pick that Armageddon, and you'll be like, well, look, I'm going White X Aggro, because nothing beats dude, all lands are gone, the game just ended generally. And sort of White-Green Aggro also goes into my personal favorite archetype, which is White-Black Aggro, because White-Black sort of gives you the same white weenies, where you have a Somaru and a Savannah Lions and Paladin Onbeck, but you also have Thoughtseize, you have Duress, you have Castigate, you have Diabolic Edict. You have a lot of removal, you have a lot of answers, and you also have things like Phyrexian Arena. So Phyrexian Arena with a bunch of creatures that are hard to deal with, like Mother of Runes, then you can slowly, basically just grind your opponent out and answer whatever creatures or monsters they have for you. Blue-Red Counterburn is a lot of times seen as just the default best archetype, because Blue-Red, you got your counter spells, and then you got your I'll Demonify your face to death, or Blue-Red, or I'll counter your stuff and slowly get incremental advantage with Jushi Apprentice, for example, and and then play like a Kega and then just kill you with it. And if you try to stop it, then you've got like Fire Ice and things of that nature. Just a lot of options and a lot of direct damage, which is generally very, very powerful. Another one that you really have to actually commit to is Reanimator. Like if you want to draft the Reanimator deck, the really cool thing about that deck is that no one is probably going to hate you out. No one is going to take the Entomb. You could probably table it. You can probably table the Zombify, and just you take the Acroma, and then the Zombify comes back. Because few people are going to take it if they're not actually in that archetype. So I love having like stuff like Hellkite Overlord and Simic Sky Swallower, and I'm sure Inkwell Leviathan is going straight into the cube because that card is just ridiculous. Your own little quickie mark to go in there and smash with, which is fantastic. Another archetype, particularly for new players, that they sort of default to, people when they just first draft the cube, is a lot of Red-Green Aggro, sort of your classic Gruul archetype. Like here's a Kurt Ape, here's a Scat Clan Mauler, here's Captain Tickles, Giant Solifuge, and I'm just going to like smash and burn you out. And you also have a lot of land destruction, which is very important, which particularly for the next archetype But like cards like Pillage and cards like Molten Rain get really important in this archetype. And if you don't have them, you may have the burn, you may have the dudes, but they'll just have the counter spells, or they'll have the wrath, and then you'll be in trouble. But if you can actually disrupt their mana and have monsters, then that's how you win games with that archetype. But it's really important to have those land destruction spells, because the most powerful archetype, by and large, is 5-color control. You have to be really careful to not let 5-color control turn into 1-color magic of person A drafts a bunch of every single mana fixing they can find, every sack land, every dual land, and the killer, which I found out after Lorwyn, was Vivid Lands. Vivid Lands are just ridiculously overpowered in Cube, because they allow 5-color control to play anything they want. I mean, if they get 2 or 3 Vivids to start off with, dual land, sack land, they begin to just take the best card in every pack. And it sounds really interesting and really fun until you just continue to play against it 3 or 4 drafts in a row, and you're like, this is not what you want the winning archetype to be. You want to have 5-color be available, but not so easily. So you want to have cards like Back to Basics and Price of Progress and things that punish them for going this route. While I have Vivid Lands currently in the queue, I plan on taking them out and replacing them with the Tricolor Shard Lands, because those seem to be just a bit more balanced. I mean, they can't be fetched with sack lands. They can't be relied on for any color of mana, and they do require you to play or draft in certain ways. The bane of 5-color control is generally the red-green aggro deck, like I said, because you have the ability to disrupt them. Because if you can't really disrupt their mana, even when you're playing white-black aggro, I can see something really good out of your hand, but generally the rest of your cards are going to be really good anyway. So, 5-color control, you look for things like Scroll Rack. You look for, obviously, a lot of artifact creatures like Solemn Simulacrum to go fix your mana. And slowly but surely they will just be like best card ever, and then you're in big trouble. So, archetypes like blue-white control, if they can't stick something like a Sacred Mesa, if they can't stick something like I was about to say a Bitter Blossom, but they're not play that. Whereas 5-color control can just be like Bitter Blossom, go off my Vivid Land, and then you're already in trouble. A few drafting tips generally for those who haven't drafted the cube as much. Generally include value mana fixing really highly. Generally a dual land or a shock land, if you see it after like pick 3 or 4, is probably someone didn't pick correctly, because those cards allow you to actually play all these awesome spells, and if you don't have your mana, then you're just going to be looking at all these great cards you can't do anything with. So if you're in a red-green archetype and you see somebody pass you a Tega, you might want to take it over the Curd Ape, just because you might get the Curd Ape back, but if you don't have that Tega, you might not be able to play anything, and then that's just really frustrating. If you commit yourself to an archetype early, that's what I would suggest. I would just be like, look, here's this spell, here's this card. Whether it's, for example, if it's Bitter Blossom, you're like, I'm gonna play something with black in it. I love to play Bitter Blossom with white-black aggro. That's my favorite thing ever, because you got Bitter Blossom on Armageddon. That's good times, seriously. But again, also for things like Reanimator, almost no one is going to hate your Reanimator cards. So that's the ability to say, oh, I've got a Simic Skyswallower or Hellkite Overlord in my opening pack. I should just pick this and not let them get the fatty, and let me keep the fatties and get the reanimation on the wheel. Let's see here. Newer players, like I said, generally draft the aggro archetypes, whatever those aggro archetypes be, whether they're white weenie, whether they're mono red, whether they're red green aggro. Another aspect I was wanting to talk about was monocolor decks. A lot of people don't really respect the power of the monocolor. For example, at the 2007 Invitational, we drafted a cube. Now, it was a cube from Wizards, but it was really fantastic. And the only person to go 3-0 was Steven Menendian drafting mono black, who took a Dark Confidant first pick over a Time Walk. And after he picked his, Dark Confidant, he got his Duress / Thoughtseize. He got the ability to play Wasteland with no problem. And then Tuco Shade, things of that nature, just little black creatures, straight up Juzum Jin, what have you. Until he was just, until his mana was so consistent, he would run over players with better cards but worse mana. And Wizards Cube was actually, I think, around 800 cards, which is about twice the size of mine. So mine is actually a lot more consistent for mana than theirs was. And they also had cards in it to allow you to do a lot more combo things, where mine is a bit more straightforward. It's a lot of controls, a lot of aggro, and then a little bit of mid-range, but there's not a lot of combo in it. You'll find that if you put a lot of combo pieces in your cube, that people will begin to either ignore them, or you'll have the one person play in the combo deck. And then people will begin to say, oh, you know, Joe Blow always plays the combo deck, so I'm just going to, you know, hate this card so they can't, you know, lock me out or whatever. So new players generally like to draft aggro archetypes such as red-green, and more veteran players sort of veer towards the control or an archetype where you have to commit yourself, where you have to say, I am Reanimator, you have to say, I am blue-white control, and I'm going to take these cards no matter what. But, you know, sizing up, another aspect I thought was really interesting is if you have someone who presents you a cube and you go, what exactly, you know, how do I play this cube? How do I draft this cube? So you can ask, you know, a few questions. You can say, you know, do you have power in it? Because that's sort of one way to look at the cube. Do you have power cards or no? Or if you have power cards, do you have power substitutes? Even that's important, because Ancestral Vision is still fantastic, even if you have to wait 4 turns for it. Another question you would ask is, how powerful is your mana fixing? How much mana fixing do you have? How many non-basics do you have? And, you know, sort of, and you can ask them, you know, do you guys generally pick it pretty highly? And you can tell by how highly they pick it, A, how long they've been playing with it, B, how powerful a 5-color / 3-color good stuff deck may be. And 3, I like to ask the question of what did you remove? What was so unfun that you guys didn't include anymore? And me personally, I began playing the cube around 2006 after I read an article by Sam Gummersall, and he had just a big list of his cube. And one of the cards that we kept finding that we were really unhappy with was Winter Orb. And Winter Orb is such a griefer card. It's such a pain in the ass. Now, I know it has its place. It's not like it doesn't. And it does certain things, particularly in weenie archetypes. You can really punish a control deck, for example. But the problem is with the control deck start playing it, and then they just make you suffer. And you know, any card that causes a grief / super frustrating situation, I just don't even bother with. I don't try to put them in there or squeeze them in there. I just say, you know what? It's better to not have this card and have more fun, even if it removes an aspect or an angle that someone can attack with. As for cube resources, I run cubedrafting.com, which I've had up for like a year and a half, something like that, where you know, I try to list my most recent cube. Thank you. I try to list my most recent cube, and I try to you know, explain my choices each time that I have a set release. What I generally do is I wait until the next set is released to add cards from the previous one. So, for example, I didn't have time to add my shards cards yet, but you know, now that we've played standard with it and we've played extended with it, we have a pretty good idea of how good these cards are. For example, when Tide Hollow Scholar first came out, everybody was like, "Is that Mesmeric Fiend good enough?" Oh yeah, it's good enough, and it'll work just fantastically. But you know, and other cards, you know, you can look fairly impressive, but won't be anything compared to what you already have. So there's, you know, particularly burn spells. You know, there's only so many you can have in your cube to begin with, and you want to be a little picky and choosy about it. In terms of, you know, conflux cards that you look at, basically at this point I've learned that every planeswalker should just go in the cube. There's no reason to not have planeswalkers in the cube. They're all awesome. Even Tezzeret, you know, even if they're very narrow, you know, they will still drive archetypes and be very powerful for the decks that have them. So definitely Nicol Bolas, obviously Path to Exile, other cards that look fantastic, you know, include stuff like Thornling, include stuff like Volcanic Fallout, you know, include things obviously like Banefire. And when you have cards like Banefire, you're like, okay, Banefire is just incredible. This card is fantastic. But now you have a choice. You have, well, you can only have so many X spells in your cube. Do you want Fireball and Get Through Fire and Banefire and Demon Fire all in the same cube? You really can't, because then you'll just have too much of a good thing, you know. And you want to be able to vary up your cube to where it can both support all these cards and have fun with these. So, in my opinion, I would probably replace Demon Fire with Banefire, because the most powerful aspect of Demon Fire was its uncounterability. And for the ability for the red-green aggro deck or the mono-red deck to beat 5-color control or blue-white control is that you can't have it countered by Force of Will, and you can't have it countered by just Counterspell. So those little decisions are on sort of either a group-by-group basis or a person-by-person basis, however you like to sort of, mold your cube, as it were. That's really all I have for my notes right now. And if anyone has any questions or whatnot, that's my 25 minutes of cube chat. Yes, sir. Mr.
Hi,
Nagel.
I'm Ken Nagel from WineyGreenMages.com. So there's game designers inside R&D that believe,
Yes.
and I quote, magic would be a better game with zero land destruction in it. And you think it's an integral part of cube/environment to have land destruction.
Yes.
Had a nice spiel about it. So,
Would you like me to expand on why?
yeah,
land destruction
expand
is
on
important?
that, please.
Sure. Without land destruction, you can you basically give certain archetypes or certain angles of attack. If you listen to certain strategy writers, you give them basically free reign. You give the X color control, the 4 color good stuff, the 5 color control, the 3 color good stuff. You give them free reign to run any mana sources they like, any lands that, like for example, Karoo lands that return a land when they come into play. You give them, carte blanche. You're like, here you go, man. Just go nuts. And there's nothing I'm going to do about it but play dudes and spells, and hopefully your spells are not better than mine. But the thing is, for those control-based archetypes, they generally are, and they cost a little bit more than your Kurde. They cost more than your Scab Clan Mauler. And so when you don't have land destruction, you give these very aggressive archetypes no outs to powerful finishers, to powerful sweepers. And if those are not present, then you can just basically get into a state where no one will want to draft Red Green aggro, because the Wrath and the Decree of Justice are just so powerful that you can't get around it, that you can't stop them before you get the tempo and kill them. And without that tempo-based land element, just certain things are not possible, or certain things are so difficult that no one wants to, continue playing those archetypes. They're like, well, I'm never going to draft Red Green aggro because I know that Joe Blow can just draft all of his Karoo lands or all of his special come into play tap lands and then just run over me with Wraths and what have you. So that's why I consider it important, and not to mention not just plain old Stone Rain, but things like Pillage, which have a little bit of sway, which you can get both their Soul Ring or their Great Land, or things like Molten Rain, which really punish the person who will draft nothing but non-basic lands or mana fixing in pack 1, and then they'll focus on all the good cards the rest of the time. So this allows you to punish those really good archetypes that are sometimes unbeatable if you don't have those types of disruption. Any other questions, sir?
You talked a little bit about how you don't play with a lot of combo cards or whatnot, because for the reasons that you explained. What other kinds of things in general should you just avoid in cube to put in your cube? Like,
Sure.
Like, are there cards that just like you shouldn't put these in there because X, Y, Z?
Well, the really cool thing about the cube is it is all basically seasoned to taste. It is your own soup. But for me, I don't put in cards that make people have unfun game states. For example, Stasis probably has no room in any cube ever. Let's face it, Stasis probably should just not even be a Magic card. But for what it's worth, any card that brings an unfun state. Because for me, the cube is just joy. The cube is just like, have fun and watch crazy things happen. And no matter how ridiculous you push it, the cool thing about the cube, as long as you have, certain things in place, the correct number of colors, correct number of spells and things of that nature, you will generally have a fantastic time. Things will balance out, and people will recognize that archetypes are more powerful than others. But anything like a Winter Orb or a Stasis for me, anything that stops people from playing too many spells, is just not great. I mean, the Decree of Silence is cute and all, and it costs a ton of mana. But for me, it would create a state in which you're sort of locked out. You're sort of like, I can't play anything else. And when you can't play anything else, then nothing really happens. And when nothing really happens, then people aren't really having fun. So if they can't attack, like Ensnaring Bridge, there's no Ensnaring Bridge in here because sometimes it's just funner to smash with dudes and have an answer in some other way, whether it's Condemn or Wrath or Austere Command or what have you. So if you think of a card and you think of it as a griefer, makes people unhappy, I generally don't put those in the queue because people just won't, they'll just stop playing. They'll be like, you know what, Winter Orb's super powerful and it totally kicked my ass, but I had such an unfun time playing against it, I'd rather not go there again. And when people stop playing it, then what do you got? You just got a big stack of really cool cards that nobody wants to play with. Any other questions? Sir?
So when you're evaluating cards for this set, and it does something that's sort of different, like sideways from what most cards do, how long does it take you, and what's your process before you determine if you want to do your cube? Like for example, Night of the Reliquary might be a good example where it's like, this is sort of a combination of two cards that we know, but maybe it's sort of strange and multicolored.
Absolutely, and that's what I find that really fascinating. For example, like Tidehole Sculler, you're like, well, you've already got Mesmeric Fiend. You know, do you really need another one? But you recognize that there are certain things about that card, like it also gets triggered off Revelar, just like Mesmeric Fiend does. And Night of the Reliquary is another one of those cards that I'm really happy that I actually wait. For example, a lot of people, as soon as the set's spoiled, you can already go to the MTG Salvation forums, and there's already people there with their cube list completely up with Conflux cards, just chock full. But, you know, the fun of Magic is the discovery, and over time, you see people really take advantage of those cards. So, Night of the Reliquary, I love it to death, and I think it's going to be a fantastic card in the cube, possibly. But if it turns out to be a mediocre card in Standard and Extended, you go, you know what, if they can't really shine in those formats, we might want to just hold off and not put it in the cube. So that's why I like to wait for an entire set and say, you know, after all this time, in all these decks, whether it's casual or whether it's in, you know, PTQ formats, these are the cards that people have noticed. And in my cube, I like to play with the best of the best. And the best of the best generally make their way to constructed decks. So if you find cards that do something different, those are the ones I really like to put in. But I'm really wary of putting them in because I want them to prove themselves. I want them to show me how good they are before I just put them in there and see that they're kind of mediocre. So I love that process, but that's why I wait a set. And people email me all the time. They're like, "Where's your shards update?" And I'm like, "Well, it's almost here because Conflux is almost here." You know, and then they ask the questions, and I try to explain it as best as I can. But thanks. Any more questions, sir?
How much master removal per color do you usually generally play?
Well, obviously, you know, white's the king, as it should be. You know, but other colors are really interesting. For blue, we had Upheaval for a while, and Upheaval. You know, basically you've got your target archetype, and then you got sort of everything else. And the other blue strategies generally have to do with control, and so they wouldn't really look into Upheaval. So if anything, blue would be the color without your default, you know, master removal spell. Of course, they do have Cryptic Command, which is the Blue Wrath of God, and that's pretty good. But again, that's just a one-turn solution for a color that is so ridiculously good at everything else. Probably shouldn't have a master removal spell. With red, you either have your Earthquake. That's my personal favorite because what red's generally doing is you're trying to burn their face out. And if you can get rid of their monsters while burning their face out, that's generally the best for me. Also, you of course have Starstorm, things of that nature if you like. I'm trying to think, what's the split-second red spell? Molten Disaster, thank you. And Molten Disaster is nice because it can get around the counter spells of the format, and you have to be able to combat the best color in Magic with the spells that are angled to do it the most damage, whether it would be Banefire coming up, or whether it's Demon Fire while it's Hellbent, or whether it's Molten Disaster while it's Split Second. As for green, you want to, obviously they don't have any master removal, but what they have is creatures that are really hard to deal with. So while Wrath will still take care of the Troll aesthetic, blue has a big problem with it, and blue has a big problem with Shroud creatures in general. And blue also has a problem with recursion. So you've got your Genesis and your Eternal Witnesses and your Survival of the Fittest and things that just continue to create advantage to where they have a problem with it. Main lands are the same way, in which they could deal with things at sorcery speed, or they could deal with things that didn't sort of turn themselves off at the end of each turn. And black actually is very interesting. We for this cube personally, we had to bring back in Bane of the Living because red-green aggro was just getting too good. Like, we had pushed it to the point where red-green aggro was the thing to draft. And so to give black an angle, we had to give them more Wrath. So obviously they have Damnation, but we also wanted to give them things like Bane of the Living to quickly, you know, give them -X, -X, and sweep the board in another way, to give black more of a board sweeper. And of course, you know, multicolor has its own, you know, little odds and ends, things that do things well, like Crime and Punishment or what have you, or a Pernicious Deed, which is probably the king. But blue, thankfully, has no master removal, and white's the king, and everyone else has angles of attack to allow them to get around. Cool. Sorry?
Do you have an ugly baby in the set in the key? like some card that you love that everybody is like, why do you have this in here? Like, I love this card, but why?
But why? Let me think. It's tough. I'm pretty brutal on the card evaluations.
Yeah.
So there's no squires. Dave Gusson's going to find one. Whatever it is, it's something ridiculous. I mean, and there's other cards that I always thought, kind of looked bad, like Waterfront Bouncer. Just seemed like, blue, discard a card. I mean, this is not what blue wants to do. But that card is actually fantastic. And that guy's ridiculous because, again, you find as you draft, particularly if you've never drafted a cube before, just pick the creatures that have the recurring abilities. Abilities you can use every single turn, whether it's 8 half-tails or Waterfront Bouncer or what have you. Or even Nezumi Short Fang. Just something that gives you that advantage over and over. And you'll find that these cards are just fantastic because they're like casting little spells every turn. And generally, there's a lot of creature removal. You'll find that cards like Waterfront Bouncer will continue to solve these monsters like a Chroma. You're like, oh, that's a really nice Chroma, bounce it, and then you smash him with some little dork. So there's not really anything I can think of that's just like horrid. but we have 2 Wizards employees looking.
Looking for your ugly baby.
They're going to find it, no doubt. But either way, I wish I could say there was. I wish there was something like right off the top of my head. I love that dorky little guy, but I'm pretty brutal about it. I really want the cards to be the best if I can find them. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Here we go.
So you're what I call a power level matters player. So like, if you make a card better, you're happier.
Yes.
It's 1-to-1 ratio. But so I played your cube, and you got an ancestral recall on your cube.
Yeah.
And I was mono green. My opponent, I think, mulligans to 5, and then ancestral recalls and blows me out anyway. And he says to me, "Thank God, I drew ancestral recall. I have lost."
Right.
All right. Now there's just no green cards in the game that are good as ancestral recall.
Right.
Do you address this by making up a card like green instant add 5 mana of any color to your mana pool? Like, I see a disparate imbalance there. I'm like, I'm on a green. There's no way I could possibly have a card as good as your ancestral recall.
Well,
that's okay with you?
Well, it's to the point where I try to put in things like, for example, Eyes of the Wisents in there, to where you want to have the green hosers. But, for me, I'm okay with the random ancestral recall blows you out. But I would like to include, the ability for mono green to be successful. But at the end of the day, mono green has an issue with that because other than stuff like Blastoderm and Troll Ascetic that are hard to deal with creatures, they can sometimes just get ran over by the blue Wrath of God or the ancestral recall or the Time Walk or the Isochron Scepter, which is also ridiculously good. And I know that there are many out there who will create their own cards to sort of have a closing of the gap between the power levels. And my group was just not cool with that. For example, I wanted to include Blast from the Past from Unhinged because I just think it's a really cool burn spell that is just really interesting and fun. But they didn't want to have any Unhinged cards. That was just their thing. Like, we don't want to have them. I'm like, well, that's fine too, I guess. But for me, it's not that you have to be only legal sets. You can have Unhinged cards in there if they do what you want them to do. If there was some Unhinged card that was ridiculously broken and mono green, I would love to have that in there to give a mono green player the possibility. But I think there comes a point in which mono white will have trouble if you don't put a little something from another color in there, or mono green will have trouble if you don't put a little something in there. And there should be enough either fixing or variance that you can add another color or add something interesting in there to give you a fight against an ancestral recall, because it does create blowouts. Power just creates blowouts, and I don't want to say they're unwinnable blowouts. That's why we have things like Eyes of the Wisent, but that's also why Eyes of the Wisent turns into like a 15th pick most of the time, because no one wants to commit themselves to green that much, or no one wants to draft the sideboard card. But I try to put them in there in order to balance things, even if it's not an exact answer to it.
So at the end of the day,
Yep.
if your play group will we're not going to play with your cube because you have ancestral recall in it,
Right.
then you are forced to take ancestral recall out of your cube
Basically.
because you will not have a player base.
Exactly.
So it's kind of similar to what
Right. I mean, there comes a point in which you have to seed things. You have to say, you know what, this card is so good, or this power is so good. Careful on your camera. That this power is so good that I can't get around it. Like the power cards have become the griefer cards. Like I am so sick of losing to first turn Black Lotus, blah blah blah. And you're like, well, okay, we'll just put Lotus Bloom in there and work it that way. So for me, it's I'm all about having fun, and a lot of my friends enjoy playing with power. And until they stop that, which means they're not going to play with the cube at all, then that just means you have a bunch of really cool cards that no one wants to play with, and that's no fun at all. So.
All right, I think I found the ugly baby.
Let's hear it.
The Sorrow's Path over here. They all look pretty good, I gotta say. I mean,
they all have their.
Some are less powerful than others, but there's nothing ugly here.
Right. There's nothing that seems ridiculously, blatantly bad, and that's generally how I like it. I can't handle the Squire. I just can't. I mean, even if it's the 15th pick, no one's going to play with it. If you're not going to play with it, or if it doesn't have sort of an archetype to go into, or an angle of attack like an Eyes of the Wisent, or a guttural response, then you should probably not be playing, in my opinion.
Real quick, we got to pause here. About 20 minutes, we're going to start Pizza Cube. Excuse me, that's my voice. I'm going to head up and start setting up for that, so just make sure you guys are wrapping up here and head up. It's one floor up and over to the corner.
Okay.
We'll be there starting at 10, so be there by 10.
Great, thanks. Sorry?
This is a two-part question.
Sure.
Are you playing the PTQ?
Yep.
No. All right, well, the second part is, can we cube draft before the build's over?
Absolutely.
All right.
Well, I definitely, actually, and I thought that the cube, that this talk was going to be able to end, and what I wanted to end it with was, who wants to draft the cube? Because that would be totally fun. And then all of a sudden, the PTQ came right after my talk, so a little awkward. But my cube is available, and I would love to draft it with you guys. So, cool.
And you said you posted on your site your current list?
Yes. CubeDrafting.com has the most recent list, and one of the first things I plan on doing when I get home is including all the Shards cards, and maybe trading for some while I'm here, because I still need some from Shards and stuff. But yeah, so that's fun. And I've got it like in a PDF to download, or an Excel spreadsheet that you can go in there and mess with the same way. So, great.
Have you ever thought about, in addition, potentially, to your aspect of Magic Cube, making one of those themed cubes, and if so, what sort of theme would you go with?
You know what? The one that most intrigues me is the tribal cube. Like, I really think that's cool. If you have the elves, and you have the elves, and you have the goblins, you have the merfolk, you have the, I don't know what the white would be. I don't know what the white would be. Soldiers, thank you. Rebels or soldiers.
Tribe seems a little better.
Absolutely, and of course you would have your zombies, and and that seems really fun to me. Like, I know that a lot of people have the common cubes, a lot of people have the crap rare cubes, where not much happens before turn 7 or whatever. But for me, it seems like you would have a really cool tribal cube. But I wouldn't want to go just one. You know what I mean? You would want to go two. You want to have both elves and beasts or something. And zombies and something that's some other black tribe, and black goblins. I don't know. But and also you can have black goblins, so you can have those cross color synergies, and that's really interesting. And we spent some time trying to create one of those, and it was just really difficult. And it was to the point where we were having balancing problems, and we're like, we should just play our cube. And so that's just what we did. But those are really challenging because they're not easy to do, and a lot of people don't have them because they are so difficult to put together. But if you can get it to work, I mean, that sounds like an absolute blast. For me, the tribal cube sounds fantastic. So it'd be like designing your own tribal set, but you get to put in your own little cross synergies. And of course, when the changelings came out, this was around Lore when we were talking about this. All of a sudden, a tribal cube became much easier because suddenly all 5 colors have options to goblins or zombies or whatever. And so that sounded like a lot of fun. Cool. Any other questions?
What are some cards you're going to put in from Shards?
From Shards, all the planeswalkers. I definitely want to put in Hellkite Overlord for the reanimation aspect. I want to put in all the Trico lands to replace the Vivid lands because they really are just too good. Like if they had 1 counter, they might still be a little too good. But with 2 counters, they're just insane. I love Tighthall Sculler, obviously. The Manu Mesmeric Fiend's fantastic. I'm thinking of others. It's a pretty high threshold. Let's see. Anything you can think of? Because that's ad nauseum.
just curious.
Not really, because like I said, when we put in combo cards in the cube to begin with, things like Voltaic Key or what have you, and Tolarian Academy and things, people just wouldn't draft it. People just, and particularly new players, you know, they won't get anywhere near a combo deck. But even veterans were just like, you know what, it's more consistent for me to draft aggro or control or mid-range. And if I'm aggro, control, or mid-range, I know that I have certain aspects. And if I try to draft combo and someone takes my Voltaic Key just to hate it for whatever reason, then I could be in big trouble because suddenly my Grim Monolith isn't as powerful. Or my Tolarian Academy just can't really get there because my Metal Worker was taken by somebody else. So for us, it took like a year or so, we just began to slowly shed them, to the point where we just weren't, using them anymore, and it just didn't become fun. And people just couldn't really win, you know what I mean? Someone would just force a will, whatever, and then they would just be dead. They'd be like, well, this is no fun to draft. I'd rather just draft dudes and do Smash. So that's what they did.
Sure.
Oh yeah, Shroom the Hegemon is fantastic. Yeah, Shroom.
Rocks Warma.
Yeah, well, that's actually, those are all the tricolor cards. The tricolor cards are actually really interesting, like the Vant Charm, and a lot of the charms, just the Jung Charm. Because right now, if you look over here, my tricolor cards include like Dromar's Charm instead of the Esper Charm or Shroom, which is probably what it probably will be. And my green, blue, black, or my green, blue, white cards, my Vant cards, include either the Charm or the Invasion Dragon, and those just aren't as powerful or as interesting to me, as you would have Shards cards. So I'm really excited about Shards, including it, and I'm probably going to have to do some sort of, either my multicolor gets bigger or my multicolor changes quite a bit. And you have to be careful in that you can't let multicolor take over your cube, because multicolor cards do so many cool things, and they are so fun to throw into the 5-color deck that you can't just throw all of them in there. But you also, over time, you'll learn that cubes grow, that you don't want to lose anything anymore. And so for me, I think I have like 55 of each color instead of 50, because as time went on, Gorman came and Morning Tide came and all those powerful cards, I just couldn't cut any, and I would just rather just bump it up a little bit, just make it a little bit bigger, just so you would not have to lose cards like Sacred Mesa, where they aren't the most powerful cards, but in the archetypes in which abuse them or use them, they are really fantastic and provide you those incremental advantages that are really that really drive winning decks. The ones that either they smash your face hard or they just get out something that slowly but surely makes you lose, and that's okay with me. So, any other questions, boys? I think it's about PTQ time. I would like to thank you, everybody, for listening, and I suggest you build your own cube. It was fun.
I always like the fatties.